Well, good morning. It is Tuesday, March 2nd, and we are gathered for a morning devotion. Again, we're using Lent for Everybody by Tom Wright. And today's scripture passage is Mark 5, verses 21 through 43, with a focus on 25 through 34. A woman who had internal bleeding for 12 years heard about Jesus. She had a rough time at the hand of one doctor after another. She spent all she had on treatment and got worse rather than better. She came up to the crowd behind him and touched his clothes. If I can just touch his clothes, she said to herself, I will be rescued. At once her flow of bleeding dried up. She knew in her body that her illness was cured. Jesus knew at once. Inside himself, the power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and said, Who touched my clothes? You see this crowd crushing you, said the disciples, and said, Who touched me? He looked around to see who it had been. The woman came up. She was afraid and trembling, but she knew what had happened to her. She fell in front of him and told him the whole truth. My daughter, Jesus said to her, her faith has rescued you. Go in peace. Be healed of your illness. And so Dr. Wright writes these words. I watched the bird take off from the field and rising quickly into the sky, float and soar on the afternoon breeze. It was free, and expressing that freedom was kind of a lighthearted joy. I wondered, reading the story at the same time, what it would look like if the bird had been tied up, close to the ground, so that every time it wanted to fly free, it found that it was unable to do so. Even with the brain of a bird, such a poor creature would, we will suppose, be frustrated to the point of despair. Now consider this woman who had suffered for 12 years with internal bleeding. She will, almost certainly, have been a family person. Almost all women in that world were married, and most were mothers. But she would have been free to be the wife. She wouldn't have been able to be the wife and mother she would naturally have wanted. The bleeding will have been exhausting in itself, debilitating, sapping her energy all the time. But far worse than that, she will have been constrained and constricted by 1,000 necessary restrictions. There was not just insensitivity and demeaning taboos. Good medical policies, granted what was known about the time, would demand that such a person avoid the risk of infecting others. She was, technically speaking, unclean. She was like a bird tethered to the ground. She could see everyone else free to live as they wished, but she was anchored, held back by her seemingly incurable disease. And yet, she made one final bid for the freedom that others had, and she didn't. At a considerable risk, because if people knew her condition, they wouldn't have wanted her pushing past them through the crowd. She came up and touched Jesus, making him too unclean, according to the normal expectations. But then the extraordinary thing happened. Instead of uncleanliness flowing from her to him, a strange power seemed to flow out of him to her. And this itself is remarkable. The Gospels don't elsewhere speak of Jesus being aware of it, as it were, a reservoir of power which he could feel being drained when such a thing happened. Instead of him becoming unclean, she was cured. And the story all came tumbling out. Jesus' response is very telling. My daughter, he said, your faith has rescued you. Your faith. Well, yes, it took a lot of faith to push through the crowd and come to touch me. If it didn't work, and if the people discovered who she was, she would not be popular, to say the least. She had to believe that Jesus really could do what she longed for. But wouldn't it have been more accurate and perhaps theologically helpful to say that it was God's power that had rescued her? Perhaps in one sense, but we are here confronted with the truth that meets us all through the New Testament. Yes, of course, God remains sovereign. Yes, of course, it's Jesus who is in charge, but the God of the Bible chose from the beginning to act whenever appropriate through human beings. Humans were never meant to be mere spectators of God's work or mere passengers being carried along into God's future with their feet up. Humans were meant to participate in God and to worship God and to be energized to live with him. And that begins with faith. There are many healing stories in which the person concerned seems not to require to believe in advance. But there are many, many stories where Jesus himself puts the weight of faith on. All the power is from God. But the channel by which this is drawn down, perhaps on the person of faith, perhaps on the one from whom it is all connected, is human faith. Stand with me at the edge of the crowd and play the scene over again in your mind. Go slowly enough to recognize the range of emotions that pass through. Perhaps you know this woman and her condition. What do you feel and think as you see her shoving her way through the crowd? Have you ever felt like that before? And how do you feel and what do you think when you see Jesus stop and look around? Are you crossed that he's been distracted from what he was on his way to do? If you were Jairus with your daughter to the point of death, that you might have been frustrated with this interruption. And what do you think about Jesus saying it was this woman's faith that had rescued her? Have you got faith like that? If not, are you a little bit jealous? Whatever your thoughts and feelings, seize the moment. Come up, yourself in the crowd. Come close enough to Jesus so that you can talk together as he walks on towards Jairus' house. He will have enough time to listen to you, perhaps. Perhaps he will ask you what you most want him to do for you. Perhaps he will challenge you. Have you got faith? Do you want to be free as a bird? And so this whole story, even though we just got a part of it about the woman who was bleeding for 12 years, I really appreciate the story because it's kind of in the middle of two other stories, and I'll let you guys look at those stories if you have time to see what's going on. The point that N.T. Wright is making in this is that, we all have faith. But do we have faith strong enough to truly see the power of God at work? I mean, he uses that image. Imagine if we were in that crowd looking and seeing this woman push through. Would we not be annoyed by her? Absolutely we would. And when she touches Jesus and would have made him ceremonial unclean, would we have been frustrated by that or outraged in the least? Absolutely. And Jesus was on his way to see Jairus and his daughter to rescue her and to heal her. If we were Jairus and found out about this interrupted, wouldn't we have issues as well? Of course we would. The point is, this woman had such faith, not knowing the first thing about Jesus, just hearing rumors and stories about him, to reach out and to be healed, to touch him, knowing what was at stake, quite possibly her life. Do we have that faith? This woman who was bleeding for 12 years surely did. And what is required of us is a deep and great faith like that. Go forth this day in the peace and the love of